afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wild Neighbor Speaker Series. This series is a collaboration with Travis County Natural Resources, who co-manages the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve with us, as well as a number of other private and public partners who also co-manage the BCP as well. Before we get started, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Jaya Torres with the City of Austin's Wildland Conservation Division. Today, we're happy to have Tyler Miloy with us to speak about the history of the Christmas bird count. Tyler is a naturalist and birder and has been a member of Travis Audubon Society, the Texas Ornithological Society, and the Nature Conservancy. Tyler has compiled the results of the Austin Christmas bird count for the last 6 years. He will present on the history of the Christmas bird count, as well as some other interesting facts you may not know about the event. We'll have a few breaks for Q&A throughout the presentation that Jeremy Hull with Travis County will be running. So please feel free to put all your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. All right, Tyler, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jaya. Hello, my name is Tyler Miloy. I am the compiler of the Austin Christmas bird count. And today we're going to talk about the history of the Christmas bird count, what it is, how it got started, and what the future looks like for this tradition. But before we get started, I want to take a second to thank you, to thank the Wild Neighbors Speaker Series, Austin Water Wildlands Conservation, Travis County, and the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, as well as to all the personnel that make this possible and for being invited to speak on this subject. Thank you very much. The Audubon Christmas bird count is an annual event in which communities of citizens come together to count the birds in North America near the winter solstice. The count is administered by the National Audubon Society, an organization whose mission is to protect birds and their habitats. All Christmas bird counts are done completely by volunteers. It originally was done on Christmas Day, but now the counts are held during the count window between December the 14th and January the 5th. There are over 2,100 count circles, all located in the Americas or in the Pacific. Each of these circles has a compiler that is responsible for coordinating the count, compiling the results, and submitting them to the National Audubon Society. All count circles have a 15-mile diameter. So this is a very large area. It's over 175 square miles. So it really does take a team of effort to attempt to count not only all the species, but also the total number of individuals of each species in the count circle, especially in one day. Since the area is so large, we typically break up into many different teams in order to cover more of the area more rapidly. This is a map of the Austin count circle. And as you can see, there are quite a few different areas. The areas are counted similarly from year to year in an effort to get more consistent data. Here in Austin, we typically form into at least 17 different groups to cover the Austin circle. In an average year, we will have over 100 participants and observe around 150 different species of birds on the day of the count. The Austin count is always held on the first Saturday of the count window. So this year's count will be held tomorrow on December the 17th. This year will be the 123rd annual Audubon Christmas bird count. The first one was held in 1900, and it is one of the very first citizen science efforts. This will be the 69th annual Austin Christmas bird count, known as the CBC. The first one was held in 1953. The Travis Audubon Society, the oldest environmental organization in Austin, was founded in 1952. The data from these surveys has been used for decades to monitor trends in both bird populations and changes in the ranges that different species inhabit in the winter. While there are now currently other methods that citizen scientists use to submit data about bird numbers and locations year-round, like Cornell's eBird and the iNaturalist apps, the information gathered during the Christmas bird counts still remains relevant, as they do provide a more concise snapshot of the species in a specific area over time. With over a century's worth of data, trends in bird numbers and changes in where they are found begin to emerge. There's been a marked decline in the number of birds in North America in the last 100 years, especially in the last 40 years, primarily due to habitat loss and the challenges and obstacles that migrating birds face. Species that migrate long distances seem to be declining faster than those that do not, primarily due to man-made obstacles that make migration more deadly. Birds often migrate at night, and city lights can cause them to be disoriented. Many migratory songbirds fly into high-rise buildings at night, causing many mortalities. The greatest decline of all groups of birds has been in grassland species, as more and more of the continent's remaining grasslands and fields get converted to residential and commercial use. Data shows that urban species, such as grackles, rock doves, starlings, and house sparrows, seem to be doing very well and have expanding populations. The good news is that just about all raptor species seem to be doing quite well, and many species like bald eagle and osprey are still increasing in numbers as they continue to recolonize areas where they were historically found before DDT caused precipitous declines in their populations before being banned in the US in 1972. Much of this data is available on the Audubon Christmas bird count website. While the data is important and very useful, acquiring it is not the reason why the CBC has become and remains so popular. Like-minded citizens coming together as a community to spend time in nature with birds and each other is the glue that holds together this annual event. For this reason, the CBC will continue into the future as long as people are willing to make the time for themselves to reconnect with the natural world and with their peers. Like I mentioned earlier, the first CBC was held in 1900. It was the idea of a man named Frank Chapman, who ostensibly came up with the idea as a way to counter the annual side hunt, a hunting competition held on Christmas Day in some households in 19th century America, where participants attempted to kill as many living things as possible in one day for sport. Although the side hunt was the reason that Chapman picked Christmas Day to do this census, there are many advantages to doing a coordinated bird count in the winter versus in warmer months. The day is much shorter at the winter solstice, so counters are not out in the field for over 12 hours in the heat. Birds are much easier to see when deciduous trees drop their leaves. Mosquitoes, ticks, chiggers, and other biting and stinging insects aren't as prevalent. And observers in the field are far less likely to step on a snake, which seems to be a perennial problem for birders because they're always looking up. We'll be exploring the problem we'll be exploring the origins of the side hunt and the other forces that made the Christmas bird count the right idea at the right time in the remainder of the program. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, throughout the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A box. So far, we don't have anything about more the history aspects. I have a couple of questions myself, but I think you may address them more throughout the presentation. So I'll kind of keep just piling those up. But as we continue, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Look at that guy. People have used things from the natural world as adornment for hundreds of thousands of years. Archaeological remains found in Italy provide evidence of bird feathers being used ornamentally by Neanderthals. Feathers were used for a very long time as decoration before they were used for other more commercial applications like insulation. Some cultures used feathers that they had collected from birds that they considered sacred for ritual use. The Mayans, in order to gain favor with their deity, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, would engage in human sacrifice. So two of the major reasons that the Christmas bird count came about, feather adornment and sacrificial ritual, have been aspects of human behavior in many different cultures for millennia. Our species has been using feathers cosmetically for a very long time. That's a resplendent quetzal. Offerings and sacrifices were used in cultures that perceived their relationship with their deities as being a transactional one. Cultural evolution has moved the majority of humankind away from killing things in order to appease the gods, but there are exceptions even today. Eventually, the deadly rituals were replaced with symbolic rituals that were then slowly changed into mere symbols of the old rituals. Some still persist up until this day. People were both using feathers for personal adornment and engaging in ritual sacrifice in Jerusalem in the year 36 AD. That was the year that a man named Stephen, a person opposed to the sacrificial cult in the Temple of Jerusalem, became aware that he was being searched for in order to stand trial before the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic court, for claims stemming from the fact that he had converted several rabbis to Christianity, among other things. Legend has it that he was attempting to avoid his pursuers when his location was revealed by a chattering wren. He was taken before the court, tried, convicted, and then executed by stoning, becoming the first Christian martyr. This supposedly is when the wren first attracted the ire of some in the Christian community. We don't know if this story is true or not, or if it was just an additional justification for the continuation, at least in some parts of Britain, of a sacrificial ritual that will continue well into the 20th century. What we do know is that if it is true, then the wren was a European wren, this little guy here, Troglodytes troglodytes, because it's the only wren species found in the Old World. There are over 80 different species of wren found in the Americas. The wren has often been associated with the winter solstice. During the cold European winters, it was often the only bird that could be heard singing. The wren is known as the king of the birds. In the olden days, there was a dispute amongst the birds about which one of them would be made king. The birds agreed that whichever one of them that flew the highest into the sky would be made king. They agreed to make their flight in unison in the morning so that all would be equally rested. That morning, it soon became clear that only the largest birds could fly extremely high. And it did not take long for the eagle to soar higher than all the other birds. The eagle continued striving for greater height and eventually became so exhausted that it could flap no further. It was at this point that the wily wren, who had been hiding in the eagle's back feathers, burst forth and flew even higher, securing its position as the king of all the birds. And for centuries, the wren was known as the king of the year, a king that must die at the winter solstice so that the robin, the European robin, could welcome in the new year. For as the wren was the king of the full year, the robin heralded in its new birth each spring, kind of like a yin and yang relationship, where there's an old English saying, the robin is to the wren as the cock is to the hen. The previous solstice sacrificial rituals that were far more barbaric than killing a bird were replaced with a less heinous sacrificial ritual, the killing of the wren king. The killing of the king during the winter solstice used to be a very real thing in some cultures. There is also the tale of an Irish attempt to sneak up on and ambush a group of Vikings that had invaded their homeland in the mid 700 8th century, about 750 AD. Legend has it that the Vikings were sleeping as the Irish approached and snuck up on them, when a wren saw a crumb of bread on the shield or a drum of one of the Vikings, began pecking at it. The Vikings woke up, were alarmed, realized they were about to be attacked. They thwarted the ambush and slaughtered the Irish. The bird's fate was linked with that of St. Stephen's, and it was often dispatched with a stone. So the killing of the wren near the winter solstice on St. Stephen's Day, the 26th of December, was justified by the tale of the bird betraying both St. Peter and the Irish, and its fate was sealed, along with that of St. Stephen's, with by being dispatched with a stone. This annual tradition was a big part of the solstice celebrations in what is now the British Isles. On the morning of St. Stephen's Day, the 26th of December, the boys and unwed bachelors of the villages would gather before dawn to catch and kill the wren, often called the ran. The boys were known as mummers and would chase a wren until it simply collapsed from exhaustion and died, or was dispatched with a stone. They would then take the dead bird and either nail it or tie it to the end of a long stick or holly branch. Then the procession of mummers wearing masks made of straw over faces blackened by cork charcoal and swatches of colorful clothing would parade their prize from house to house throughout the town, singing one of their many ran songs. They would carry a small wooden coffin for the wren to be buried in so that the old year could be put to rest. All of the wren songs made a plea for a penny to help cover the funerary expenses of the dead king. This basically was a form of extortion. All these young men were wearing masks, right? Where anyone refusing to contribute might find the dead bird buried in their yard, or worse. Many of the wren songs used repetition and alliteration to literally enchant the listeners, completing the pagan connection to the event. Funds from the effort were used to hold dances, mainly just to acquire alcohol and get drunk that night. King Henry VIII's Anglican Church came along and pretty much put an end to the annual wren killing ritual in England proper. It survived almost exclusively in western parts of southern England, Wales, the Isle of Man, and in Catholic Ireland. The Catholic priests became very concerned about the level of debauchery associated with the party the mummers were throwing every year. And eventually they were able to usurp the funds from the effort and guarantee the tradition's demise. Although the practice did continue well into the 20th century, in the end, no actual wrens were killed. They simply turned the ritual into a symbolic act. They still have Mummers Day parades in parts of Ireland, and in that part of the tradition even moved over into parts of Newfoundland. And typically those are held on the 1st of January now. In the 1840s, many a young mummer was forced to flee their native homeland of Ireland in order to avoid starvation during the Irish potato famine. Many of these refugees came to America. Over half of all immigrants to the US in the 1840s were from Ireland. And they brought with them their customs and their culture, including the tradition of killing birds around Christmas time. As these new Americans began to mingle and settle with the existing populations of Scotch, Welsh, and English settlers, especially in Appalachia, they started to share their custom of bird killing at the winter solstice. This is the origin of the side hunt, a competition held on Christmas Day where men would take sides, form into teams, and start killing everything they could see, basically. Anything that breathed was considered fair game. The side with the most kills, at the end of the day, won. This was basically the most base form of human behaviors, bloodlust, pure and simple, though there was a very real reason to put venison on the table during the lean months. This tradition was simply sick and wasteful. The proliferation of inexpensive ammo, in conjunction with the seemingly endless number of animals and birds to kill relative to Europe, proved to be a deadly combination left up to males who were not aware of the consequences of their behavior. The annual killing ritual continued to grow in the US into the second half of the 19th century. After a few short years, there were a lot less birds and other wildlife left to kill. That's a hat. So the other that led up to Frank Chapman's decision to initiate the Christmas bird count was a millinery trade. And the first documented fashion fad concerning feathers in women's hats seems to have started in northern Italy, in Milan, in the first half of the 15th century. The fad had largely run its course by the middle of the 16th century, but not before first working its way into London, where clothing and hats from Milan were sold to women by milliners, the origin of the word millinery. Not much more was heard about feather hats until one day in the late 18th century, when in France, at the court of King Henry XVI, his wife, Marie Antoinette, walked into the court with a hat on that had one singular ostrich plume adorning it. This is where the fashion trend of attaching feathers to hats, a fad that would last into the 20th century, began to take off once again. It was slow to catch on at first, but over time, as more bird species were discovered across the globe, the variety of feathers available began to increase exponentially. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that the trend really exploded. The millinery trade began to boom, especially in the northeastern United States, due to the different hat designs available and because of the proliferation of different types of feathers that were coming in from all over the planet, all fueled by a fashion trend. Millions of dollars in 1800s money began to change hands because of this fashion trend. Hunters would travel to the ends of the earth to get different types of feathers. The business of bringing feathers from abroad into the US for commercial use was known as the fancy feather trade. Groups of armed hunters would begin working their way down the Atlantic coast in search of bird rookeries. They would set up at the rookeries where the parent birds were compelled to return to the nest in order to feed their chicks and kill each and every single adult bird, wiping out entire rookeries one by one of species like great egret, snow egret, roseate spoonbill, and many others. At one point, great egret feathers became worth their weight in gold. When the Titanic was sunk, the most valuable cargo on board was 40 crates of bird feathers that had been insured for over $2.3 million. Only diamonds were valued more per weight at that time. Bird numbers began to dwindle, especially in the Northeast, where both the great auk and the Labrador duck would both become extinct before 1900, soon to be followed by the heath hen, the passenger pigeon, and the Carolina parakeet. You know, the Carolina parakeets with those colorful feathers, they're really highly sought after, and because of their social nature, all it took was one of them being injured for the rest of the flock to rush to their aid. And so it was very easy to capture entire flocks with one net. So things were not looking too good there for a while. It was a big business, and the number of Americans employed in the millinery feather industry began swelling. It was well over 880,000 Americans were employed in this business in the early 1900s. Between the side hunt and the women's hat fashions, things looked pretty bleak for these birds in the US as the 19th century started to close. Does anybody have any other questions?
None yet.
Okay. All right, well, we're just going to jump right into how this dilemma was resolved. This is Frank Chapman again, In 1888, he was a 24-year-old young man. He got a job working at the American Natural History Museum on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Frank was an amazing person. During his 54-year-long career with the American Natural History Museum, he would help pioneer the concept of dioramas for museum displays. You know, previously you'd walk into a natural history museum, they'd open a door and go, yep, we got a bunch of dead stuff here you can look at. So he was kind of a pioneer with that, a concept which is employed by museums around the globe still to this day. Soon after his employment, he began to notice that there were a large number of different bird species feathers adorning the heads of women around New York City. Some of these were from species of birds that the museum did not even have a specimen of. Over the course of 2 days, walking around the city, one weekend, he counted over 750 women wearing hats, of which of those, over 450 of them had bird feathers on. Often these were common species, but for more exotic feathers, pink feathers, flamingo feathers, roseate spoonbill feathers, you know, people would pay a lot of money. Now, men in the U.S. also wore feathers as adornment and had been doing so since before the country was founded. Some of the millinery shops would hack up different bird species, then splice them back together. This is, you know, there you go. There's some fashion for you, right? And they would splice these species back together to create a Frankenbird that they would like affix to a hat and then sell for an outrageous price. I think that's a cardinal egret combo there. Gods. Anyway, upon seeing these specimens, Chapman became even more concerned about what he was witnessing. In 1899, Chapman started Bird Lore magazine. It was a publication that would go on to become the Audubon magazine in 1940. It was in this publication during the nascent days of the founding of the Audubon Society that Chapman first proposed the concept of counting birds on Christmas Day instead of shooting them. He did this in order to counter the practice of the side hunt. But it was also done to raise awareness about the dangers that birds face due to the millinery trade. On Christmas Day, Frank and 27 others of 1900 went out into the field and counted as many species and number of birds as they could and shared their findings. This was the first Christmas bird count. It was also one of the very first citizen science efforts. It took time, but the concept expanded, annually as more and more people, a large number of them women, began to earnestly work to change public opinion about birds and the natural world. The Royal Society for the Preservation of Birds in England started a public relations campaign to dissuade women from wearing feathered hats. Many, including Virginia Woolf, thought that the campaign was hypocritical because it blamed women, but had failed to mention that it was primarily men who were profiteering from the trade. Public opinion began to change slowly, fueled by lobbying efforts of bird preservation groups, especially women, involved in newly formed Audubon clubs throughout the northeastern United States. Teddy Roosevelt was elected president at the turn of the century, the first conservationist president. Roosevelt was listening to Muir and others at the time and truly did change both public policy and sentiment in a way that was extremely beneficial, especially in the long run. He signed the Lacey Act into law, legislation that forbade the transport of poached game across political boundaries. He created 5 national parks, 51 different bird sanctuaries. He also set aside more than 100 million acres for national forest. It was a very strong beginning. And over time, the number of Christmas bird counts began to increase. It took a couple of decades, but eventually the side hunt became something that only persisted in the most remote and backwoods parts of the nation. By the early 20s, women who continued to wear feathered headdresses in public were lampooned in the papers and shamed in public, to the point that no woman would dare be caught out in public sporting a feather. Also, fashion trends began to change after World War I, and people started wearing much, much smaller, simpler little hats. The tide had begun to turn, and mankind's better nature had started to prevail over more base tendencies like blood sport and vanity. So in 2019, there were almost as many people participating in Christmas bird counts, over 81,000, as there used to be employed in the feathered millinery industry in 1900. One of the primary reasons that the Christmas bird count has remained so popular and will continue to be so well in the future, despite other more versatile forms of citizen science bird documentation, like iNaturalist and eBird, is that it provides a much needed excuse for folks to do what they really want to be doing, which is spending time in nature, reconnecting with old friends, and making new ones. The data and citizen science aspects are the fruits of communities of birders spending time together in a common, fun task. Often folks are so busy with their daily routines that they don't make the time to do the things that they really love. The annual count allows people both the excuse and the opportunity to make the time to be in nature and with their friends. This is the heart and soul of the Christmas bird count. Something that can never be replaced with an app. Thank you for allowing me to share. Does we have any questions, Jeremy?
Yeah, I had a couple that came through directly, but so, you mentioned this at the start, but I wanted to reiterate that someone asked, where would they go to see the results of this year's or past year's counts after they're compiled and submitted? And so Jaya posted the Audubon Christmas bird count website to the chat, so everyone can go take a look at that. And I'll get her to post that one again. Another person just asked here in the chat, is there a similar count in Europe that still goes on?
That's a really great question, and Europe has a different system they use, but they do have coordinated counts. The U.S. Audubon Society is paired up with a Canadian conservation group, and so there's really kind of a seamless effort throughout North America and on into South America and American possessions in the Pacific, etc. Whereas Europe and the rest of the planet kind of do their own thing. Some of these other data sharing and acquiring applications like iNaturalist and eBird are used globally, but there's no concerted effort on the part of the National Audubon Society to do, count circles on other continents other than the Americas at this point.
Excellent. Another just noted that this was completely fascinating. They had no idea of the European origins to the Christmas bird count, and they were happy about that. Another person asked what species in Travis County are in the most danger. Before I give you a crack at that question, I'm just going to say that we host this as part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve System that protects habitat for an endangered bird that most of us in Travis County know of, called the golden cheek warbler. It's a critically endangered bird species found that breeds only in Central Texas. So I'd say that one is definitely high up on the list, but do you have any others that you would say are kind of in the most danger nowadays?
Well, those two species typically aren't found in the Austin count circle, and they're really not even in this part of the continent at this time of year. So we do notice trends with species that aren't as common. Sparrow species, like I mentioned earlier, is really a problem. They're grassland species typically, and there's just less area. I don't have to tell you, if you're looking around, every square foot is getting concrete poured on it if somebody can make $1 doing it. So from my perspective, one of the things that is the greatest danger for not just birds but the entire natural world, especially in North America, is low interest rates, because that fuels speculative development, and these are one of the primary thing that causes habitat destruction. So sparrows, less of them, depending on the species. One of the funnest things about these counts is we always get, different species that we typically don't see here during the winter. Sometimes there's species that aren't supposed to be here. Thing about birds is they have wings, so they pretty much could be anywhere they want to be, anytime they want to be. So really the summer is the only time where you're going to find, during breeding season, that is, birds where they're supposed to be, which is on the breeding territory. Other than that, they can pretty much be anywhere they want to be. A lot of folks think that, migration is fueled by colder temperatures, and in a sense it is, but birds don't migrate south to avoid the cold. They migrate to find better food sources. They can handle the cold if they get enough calories. So we see a lot of birds that migrate here in the winter only for their wintering habitat, and some years we'll have eruptions where some species from up north will pour into the south more than normal. Either they had a really good summer and a good breeding population and had a very successful breeding season, and all these guys will come down south and we'll see a lot of species we typically don't see in the winter. Or sometimes conditions up north have changed that force them to move further south for species that forage on the ground, like little sparrows. Certainly if the snow's a foot thick in Oklahoma, those guys are heading down into Texas, right? And same is true with ducks and waterfowl. They'd stay up north all winter if their lakes didn't get super hard. So when that happens, they're compelled to move south as well.
Excellent. Since you mentioned that you have been compiling in the Austin count for 6 years, and you kind of talked about that count being a little bit more rural count, I had 2 specific questions about compiling. I've participated in a lot of these counts, and I've ran some of them, but I have not done compiling. But what is the most challenging thing that you have to deal with as a compiler every year?
That's a great question, Jeremy. You would think it would be the personnel, coordinating the personnel and getting the folks to be where they're supposed to be, when they're supposed to be, to count the areas they're supposed to count. That's the easiest part, because it's not hard to get folks to do what they really want to do. So that's the very easiest part. Sometimes last minute things pop up, and getting certain areas covered if people are ill or whatever can be a challenge to move personnel around. But It does take a little bit of time, especially with a count that has a bunch of attendees to get all the stuff together. Oftentimes, the most difficult part of it, believe it or not, is getting all the participants to submit their paperwork to the compiler so he could get his paper, get everything turned into the Audubon. So that could be a challenge, depending. But most of the people in the Austin group are extremely good about this, so it's not as big a problem as it potentially could be.
Yeah, I'll have to say I'm one of those that, the day after the count, trying to get my paperwork together and trying not to be the last one to do it. So, as a compiler, you don't have, how are birds considered? So there are birds considered rare in the county. You've mentioned that earlier. What factors go into determining whether a bird is rare or not? And like, how many years does a bird have to be observed before it may be moved into a?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeremy. So each count has should have its own specific, if not unique, list of birds that are both to be expected and considered common. In other words, you might see this bird during this count. I keep a running tabulation of all the counts, and if we've observed a bird in the count circle twice or more during the last 10-year period, it automatically goes on the official checklist. And so once it's on the checklist, you just got to note it's there and stuff. If a bird is not on our checklist, well, regardless of how many times a person has seen it or how common it is here in June, we need to have some documentation, ideally a photo to, prove that, it was here at that time, because it's either out of range, in the wrong spot at the wrong time, or a bird that just shouldn't be here, So, and this does happen. It's one of the interesting things, at the end of the counts, when we get together, get all our data together. One of the most interesting parts of it is finding all these goodies that we weren't expecting to see. That's one of the beautiful things about getting out in the field, is we cannot control what we're going to encounter. We can encounter anything. We just have no idea. There's only one way to know, and that's to get out there.
Excellent. So we had two questions come in the same vein, and so we'll kind of combine these together. One is, how can someone get involved in a CBC either this year or next year? And then, are there other events during the year that the public can get involved in with the Audubon Society?
Yes, certainly, no matter where you're hearing this, your local Audubon chapter is going to be a great place to start. Travis Audubon here locally in Central Texas, wonderful organization. Highly recommend, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, to get involved with that organization, become a member. There are chapters throughout the whole United States. Different areas have different ways of posting when their counts are coming up. One of the National Audubon Christmas Bird Count site has some information about that. But one of the resources we use here locally in Texas, anyway, is the Houston Audubon website, where they have a detailed list of all the Texas counts, the compilers, how to get a hold of them. And, it's just a great way to find out about local counts in your area and get information about who to contact, become involved. I definitely recommend it. It's a great way to learn more about birds, to meet new people, and just to have a great time getting out there in nature.
Yes, and Jaya will be posting several links to the chat before we end, and she's going to include the Travis Audubon CBC website so that folks can find out more information about that. And then, kind of on that same vein, we still have a couple more minutes here, and there's still some questions rolling around. Is, for a person showing up to their very first Christmas bird count, maybe top 3 tips for a newbie? And I have
dress appropriately. These can be dressed appropriately. Binoculars help. That makes it a lot easier if folks, spot something, and sure is a lot to be learned by going around with some of these experienced people in some of these groups. That's really where it's at. Is there are kind of two ways to do things. The hard way, or have somebody show you. So it's a great opportunity for that. The weather is big. Having some binoculars, having a good attitude, being flexible, because we're trying to cover a big area here. Oftentimes we'll have new people get involved, and they'll just want to do half a day or so, and that's great. We love that. That's fabulous. And we can use the help. And part of this is community outreach to get more people involved. Both with the bird counts and just being aware and cognizant of their surroundings and nature in general, and birds and other species around them. So it's a great way to do that. Most of the folks who participate annually are more serious birders who bird year round, but really look forward to this opportunity to get together with their friends and spend some time out there.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. And I'll just add that, anyone wanting to jump into these, lean on those experts in those groups, and don't be afraid to learn, and don't be afraid to ask questions, because the people doing this love to bird and they love sharing their knowledge. And so it's a great opportunity for that. Two more questions here. And the thing for now, Kayla, I'm going to get to yours next because we'll go back a little bit. But Kat asked, I struggle with hawk identification and noticed that the checklist include general categories like Butiospa. How helpful is using this category when determining species success or distribution?
Well, when those are some categories on the checklist that don't name the specific species. I saw a hawk, and I don't know what species it was. So it kind of gives us an idea, and it really doesn't give us specific data about specific species. But what it does do for us is lets us know that, hey, there's a couple hawks out there, so as far as to specifically, a particular species, that really doesn't help much. But just knowing some birds were observed, there have been checklists I've seen where people have went out of their way to report that the number of hawks they saw was 0. And because what that is no data is some data, in this particular instance, so every little bit helps. I'm not sure exactly how the Audubon Society utilizes those particular snippets of data, but it's better than no data at all on those subjects and those birds.
Exactly. We had another person ask when we were talking at the beginning about the history and of the counts and things. Do you know when the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed?
Yes.
What were the main
factors? I can't believe I just glossed over this whole section of my talk. Yeah, 1918, signed in by President Wilson. There were a lot of efforts put forward by women in particularly, who lobbied extensively for Audubon Society and clubs to get these issues brought to the forefront. And so the Migratory Bird Treaty Act really was phenomenal because it banned the possession of feathers from wild birds. And that just was a death knell for the millinery trade with feathers anyway. So that, I cannot believe it, but yeah, it was my notes. I glossed right over it. So there we go. So yeah, it was really a big deal, and it continues to be a big deal today. We've had recently, we've had some executive actions in the last few years at the national level geared at dismantling the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Fortunately, a current executive has reversed most of those, so things are back on track.
Excellent. Yes, and the Audubon website that that Jaya posted earlier about the Christmas bird count has the whole history section that talks about that and ties it into the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well as how the data is used, going back to some of our other questions for how it's been used over time. So I encourage folks to go check that out. On that note, that wraps up all the questions for now, unless anyone has anything else. Leaves us with about 5 minutes. So unless anyone has anything there, I will probably go ahead and wrap it up from here. Tyler, I would just like to thank you for your talk. There was a lot of information there, and the history of it all, especially with the side hunt. I'd heard about that in the past, but I'd never tied it to the bird count. And I just think it's all great information. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate you.
And, oh, well, let's see, did I just, oh, yeah, no, I thought it was more questions, but people are just popping in thank yous in the thing and saying that it was a great talk and that they enjoyed it. So again, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining the Wild Neighbors Speaker Series, and we hope to see you here in the future.